Hey, how's it going, everybody? It's Timothy here with Mana Rocks, and we are going to wrap up our Throne of Eldraine limited set review this time. Quick shout out to all the people in the comments who have corrected certain things I said about cards. In particular, the note about adventures, that if the adventure half does not resolve, maybe it gets countered or the target gets removed in response to you targeting it, that the card will go to the graveyard. It will not go to exile, and you don't get to cast the creature half, which is kind of important, right? Something to keep in mind there. I don't think there are any adventures for us to talk about this time because we're talking about the colorless cards. That includes all of the non-colored artifacts that we haven't already talked about, in addition to all of the lands. There's a couple cycles of lands, and then a few extras just floating around. So we'll go ahead and talk about all of those cards here. If this series, if this video in particular has been useful for you, if it helps you in any way, shape, or form, feel free to subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments below that it's been helpful. If you have any advice on how to tweak these set reviews, make them a little bit shorter. If I'm giving too much information, too little, let me know below. And you can find us on Twitter at MTG_ManaRocks. With all that being said, let's go ahead and kick the video off. Again, starting out with our sideline cards, the cards that we're not really looking to put in our main deck, either because they are sideboard cards that have an impact after we know what our opponent's playing, or they're build-around cards that require the right support and cast to be good in our deck, or in the case of some of the artifacts, they're just stone-cold unplayable. Let's see what we've got here. So starting off with Crashing Drawbridge. This is a 2-mana artifact. It is a 0/4. It's a common wall with Defender, and it taps to give all of your creatures haste until end of turn. I don't actually like this card at all. If you're playing defense, then you don't care about the haste, and if you're playing offense, you really don't want an 0/4 Defender in your deck. People tend to love cards like this, right? We've seen Bloodlust Insider, Goblin Instigator, these like little dorky 1-mana creatures that come down and give a creature haste by tapping, and people seem to always fall in love with that. I don't think this is a particularly aggressive format given the life gain from clues, or rather food, just the late game nature of adventures and stuff like that. And I just don't see a deck that wants Crash and Drawbridge. If you are playing an aggro deck, just play more aggressive creatures. Don't sit here and waste your time with a 0/4, right? Same thing I said about Crystal Slipper, right? If you really want your creatures to attack, just play them on curve and then attack with them normally. Don't waste a turn getting a creature down or a card down that then makes your creatures attack off curve, right? It's just not worth it, and I don't really see this wall having a home in this format. Witch's Oven is a single mana for an uncommon artifact. You can tap it and sacrifice a creature to create a food token. If you sacrificed a creature with toughness 4 or greater, you create 2 food tokens instead. I'll say it once, or I've already said it once, I'll say it again. There are not a lot of expendable creatures in this format. There are some ways to make tokens, but it's not like a prevalent theme of the set. There's not a lot of repeated token generation, and outside of things like the Cauldron Cat and Rally to the Throne and stuff like that, there's just not a lot of ways to make bodies that you want to just sacrifice. What Witch's Oven is good at is sacrificing creatures that are no longer relevant in the game. I'll probably mention this again in this video, but white and blue in particular have a bunch of enchantments like So Tiny, Sleep Lullaby, the Trapped in a Tower, so on and so forth, Frogify, right? There's a bunch of enchantments that make your creatures kind of useless on board, and then Witch's Oven gets pretty good at just turning those into something, right? But as far as I'm concerned, if you're playing a food deck and you really need food, I don't want to just sacrifice creatures all over the place, right? I want to make sure the creatures I'm sacrificing are something that I'm okay getting rid of, and there's not a lot of that to go around in this format. So I'm viewing Witch's Oven more as a sideboard card against enchantment-based removal than I am a main board card, but I can be proven wrong, right? If it turns out that making food is just that important and you're willing to sacrifice any little dorky creature to get it, then sure, Witch's Oven will go up a knob, but I don't think it's ever going to be that great. Lucky Clover is basically a definition of a sideboard card, or rather a build-around card, excuse me. It's 2 mana for an uncommon artifact. It says when you cast an adventure, instant, or sorcery, copy it, and you may choose new copies for the target. New targets for the copy, excuse me. Yeah, so if you have 0 adventures in your deck, this card does nothing. If you have 1 or 2, you probably don't want it. If you're really the quote-unquote adventure deck, you're white-green, you're all in on adventures, you have some of the payoffs, then Lucky Clover seems decent, right? it runs the same risk as a lot of other build around cards, where maybe you just cast all your adventures and then on turn 7 or 8 you draw your lucky clover and it's just a little bit embarrassing in your hand, right? This card doesn't do anything at all as a standalone card, so you need adventures and you need a lot of them for this card to be good. I'm thinking 6+, 7+ is where I'd want to be before I'd even consider Lucky Clover, and even then the adventures would have to be pretty impactful. Most of them just pump your power and toughness temporarily, and doubling up on that doesn't seem like it's worth the whole card here and the risk of running a potential blank in your deck, but who knows, maybe that deck is really good. I mentioned it with the Wandermare, the white, green, gold card, that I don't know if that deck is going to come together that often, right? Since a lot of the payoffs are uncommons, but there are plenty of payoffs and there's plenty of adventure cards. So maybe Lucky Clover's good, but we can all agree that it should stay in the sideboard if you don't have the right number of adventures to support it. Sorceress Spyglass is back for some reason. I guess they just really want this card in Standard. You should know this card if you've played Standard anytime recently. It's 2 mana for a rare artifact. When it, or rather as it enters the battlefield, you look at the opponent's hand and then you choose any card name. Doesn't have to be a card that they have in their hand. You can just choose anything. And then your opponent can't use activated abilities of the card that you named unless they're mana abilities. This is basically a way to fight very specific activated abilities, maybe a tapper, maybe a planeswalker, something along those lines, but it's not really here for constructed, or rather it's not here for limited, it is here for constructed. As far as limited goes, this is not a card you should basically ever mainboard, and you would have to be hard pressed to sideboard it, right? Maybe if your opponent has a Garruk or an Oko or something like that, then Sorcerer's Spyglass can be a good way to take care of that card. But outside of those extreme situations where you have this rare and your opponent has a specific mythic rare, I would just leave this in the sideboard. And even if you see your opponent using activated abilities, it's probably not worth bringing the Spyglass in. It just doesn't do enough, doesn't stop the board, doesn't stop creatures from actually just attacking you and things of that nature. So a little bit too narrow for my taste, but there are a few cards that it does shut down. Tournament Grounds is a land for knights and equipment. It's an uncommon land. It taps for colorless on its own, or you can tap it for Mardu colors, red, white, or black, but you can only use that mana to cast knights or equipment. So obviously very specific, very build around. If you have an abundance of those things in your deck, then this is going to help you fix your mana, right? If you end up in exactly Mardu Knights, which you probably will some amount of the time, the overlap between the 3 different color pairs for knights does come together to make a solid knight deck, then yeah, Tournament Grounds is going to help you a little bit. I don't really care that this helps fix for equipment, since most of the equipment I want to play is either already on color or just not that good and worth running in the first place. So you know when you want this card. If you end up in a Mardu deck but you only have like 5 or 6 knights, then yeah, Tournament Grounds is probably worth just putting in. But if you have 3 or 4 knights in your deck, don't be kind of caught off guard by this card. It's not really worth running. It's a little bit too specific on what it can help cast, so it's not going to help you as often as you think it would. But sure, if you're running Mardu Knights, go ahead and take the land. And that moves us out of our sideline category into the filler category. These are cards I'm not really looking to put in my deck. I don't want to, but I imagine I'll play them a couple times throughout this format, even though I'm trying to get them on the wheel when it comes to drafting. The first one is Weapon Rack. This is a 4 mana artifact. It's a common, and when it enters the battlefield, or rather it enters the battlefield with 3+1/+1 counters on it. Kind of interesting. Don't see that too often. You can tap it and remove a +1/+1 counter from it onto target creature, but only at sorcery speed. Man, this is already expensive enough that this could have been instant speed and it would have been fine, right? Essentially what you're doing is over the course of 3 turns, you're paying 4 mana to put 3+1/+1 counters wherever you want, right? You can only do 1 per turn, so it's a little bit slow. And honestly, if this was just 4 mana for a sorcery that said put 3+1 counters wherever you want to put them, that wouldn't be that good, right? The upside, and that's very loose on upside, is that it's an artifact that just stays on the battlefield, so it might matter for your blue-white decks that care about your artifact count or something along those lines. But overall, this is a pretty weak effect. You do get some power out of it, although it's rather slow. So if you're in some sort of flyer deck that also cares about artifacts, maybe this is a card you want. But for the most part, it's a little bit too slow on what it does and a little bit too expensive for the overall effect that you get, that I'm not really looking to play it that often. Roving Keep is up next. 7 mana for a 5/7 common wall. Interesting, 7 mana wall. It has Defender. You can pay 7 mana, and it gets +2/+0 and trample and loses Defender, essentially. Being a wall is actually a liability in this set. There's like 2 cards that actually either destroy or can't be blocked by walls, which is a little bit interesting. This card, I imagine, just kind of sucks. Again, if you really are hard-pressed for an artifact, I don't think a 7 mana artifact is really what you're looking for. And the activated ability is just way too much, right? You're using your whole 7th turn to get this creature down, and then you have to use your entire 8th turn just to make this thing be able to attack. And that is potentially just the biggest blowout you can imagine, right? You spent your entire 7th, 8th turn, 14 mana, and then your opponent like bounces this back to your hand in response or something like that. It does become a 7/7 trampler, but that's not even that impressive for 7 mana. I want a little bit more out of that if I had to pay basically this card's mana cost twice. It does kind of stabilize the board, but I don't know. If you need some late game finisher, then this is probably not the card you want, but I imagine it'll make your deck every now and then, and you will see this card on the battlefield. It's just very exploitable, and not even super impressive when it does get to start attacking. Lochthwain Gargoyle is a single colorless mana for a 0/3 common artifact creature. It's a gargoyle. For 4 mana, you can give it +2/+0 and flying until end of turn. I'm not really seeing the power level of this card here. 4 mana is just a lot to attack for 2 in the air or block for 2 in the air, and it's not even like you can really hold that mana up and use this as a blocker. It's just a little bit too much, right? You're basically skipping turns to get small amounts of damage in. This is very cheap, very clearly just a cheap artifact for decks that want artifacts, but you can do better than this. It's not a good attacker, it's not a good blocker, and even without the activated ability, it really isn't a good standalone card. Jousting Dummy is up next. It's 2 colorless mana for a 2/1. It's a common artifact creature. It's a Scarecrow Knight. And for 3 colorless mana, you can give it +1/+0 until end of turn. And that's it, right? It's a field creeper with upside, which isn't really something to write home about. It is a Knight, and the reason I think this card is in the set, even though it kind of sucks, is it just gives you an extra Knight for your Knight decks, right? If you absolutely are just looking for Knights for Knight synergy, and you don't really care what the creature is, you're just looking for the tagline on it, then Jousting Dummy is here as an easy-to-cast Knight in your Mardu decks, but it's not very good, right? This doesn't even really threaten to trade up that much, since 3 mana is a lot for a single point of power. 6 mana to trade up for like a 4/2 just isn't as impressive as some of the other cards with similar activated abilities, but I don't know. If you need Knights, then this card is here, but you can even do better than that. Hengewalker is 3 colorless mana for a 2/2. It's a common artifact creature. It's a golem, and it has adamant. If 3 mana of the same color was spent to cast this spell, it enters with a +1/+1 counter on it. Doesn't matter what color it is, as long as you just paid triple color of the same amount, or rather 3 of the same color for Hengewalker. I think this card is just going to be too bad to play most often. I don't think it should make the cut in your deck. If somehow you end up in a monocolored deck, then Hengewalker becomes a little bit better, but the ceiling is a 3 mana 3/3, and there's a ton of those floating around this format, so it's not like the ceiling is even that high, and the floor is pretty low. A 3 mana 2/2 is just not a justifiable card. So even though this is a colorless creature, it's basically a triple color card. If you're in a 2-color deck, you're not going to be able to turn 3 this as often as you would like, and that's a little bit of a downside, right? If you play this on like turn 5 with triple color, and it comes down as a 3/3, that's just not impressive either. So overall, I think Hengewalker misses the mark. And sometimes in a monocolored deck, it'll make the cut, but even then, it's not super impressive. And that, to me, the ceiling being as low as it already is, just doesn't seem like it's worth the work you have to put in to make Hengewalker consistently good. Gingerbread, everybody's favorite card, is 1 colorless mana for a 1/1. It's a common artifact creature. It is a food golem, which is really interesting. I think this is the only creature in the set that is also a food. Worth noting, I don't think it matters for this set, but food is not a creature type. It is an artifact type, so you can't name food with like anything that cares about creature types. It has haste, so 1 mana, 1/1 haste, not really cutting it. For 1 colorless mana, you can make it unblockable except by creatures with haste. Very weird ability since most of your opponent's creatures with haste are going to be attacking and tapped already, but it's there for flavor reasons, right? You can't catch the gingerbread man unless you have haste. For 2 mana, you can tap and sacrifice gingerbread to gain 3 life, so it has the food ability tacked onto it too, which is kind of neat. Very flavorful card, but not a good one by any stretch. The activated ability, the first activated ability rather, is, borderline useless unless you're playing this in standard in some like cavalcade deck, but even then it kind of sucks. And without the activated abilities, this card just isn't really a full card. It's like half a card, and being able to turn it into some life later in the game just doesn't matter. Don't play gingerbread unless you are just the most hyper aggressive deck in the world. And even then, I don't think this is what you're looking for. It does wear equipment pretty decently, right, as will any unblockable creature or evasive creature in this format. So if you're an aggressive deck that also has equipment, maybe this goes a little bit up in value, but as it stands, it's not that great. It is a food. Some decks will want it for that reason alone, but I would rather prioritize something that just makes food tokens. Spinning Wheel is 3 colorless mana for an uncommon artifact. It taps for any mana, 1 mana of any color, or you can pay 5 mana and tap it to tap target creature. I actually kind of like this card. It is another mana fixer, which we've seen a couple of in green particularly. So if you're into a 3-color deck, or if you're looking to ramp a little bit, then Spinning Wheel will get the job done as just a straight up manalith, and then that tap ability will probably come up a little bit more than you think. 5 mana is just way too much to tap a creature, but as a bonus on a mana rock, I think that's fine, right? You won't use it that often, but it can buy you some time in a very late game deck, or you can use it in an aggressive deck to just get a blocker out of the way. Not something you should rely on. You don't take this and think of it as a tapper. You take this and think of it as a mana ramp card or a mana fixing card that also has an extra activated ability on it that you may or may not end up using. And I think that's fine if you're interested. You really want to be interested in the first activated ability and consider the second activated ability a bonus before you go taking this card. Sorcerer's Broom is 2 colorless mana for a 2/1 uncommon spirit artifact creature. Whenever you sacrifice another permanent, you may pay 3 mana. If you do, create a token that's a copy of Sorcerer's Broom. I think this card has some build around potential, and it could be quite strong, but it does have a really costly effect, and most of the effects that sacrifice other things also cost mana, so you're really thinking you need about 5 mana before you can actually make copies of this card. And as a standalone 2 mana 2/1, that's passable, but not really something you should be putting in your deck unless you're using the ability. This reminds me of the self-replicator from Dominaria that could copy itself whenever you cast historic spells. It just never really made the cut because it was already too expensive to get it on board and get it going, and Sorcerer's Broom seems very similar, right? A lot of times when you're sacrificing a food or something like that, you don't really want to use your extra 3 mana floating around to make 2/1s, but hey, if it's free, right? If you don't have anything better to cast for the turn, then you might as well make some extra creatures, and you do need a lot of ways to sacrifice permanents before this card becomes that good, but food does it on its own. So in a dedicated food deck, maybe Sorcerer's Broom makes the cut, but you need a lot of mana before it really starts to go off. Shambling Suit is up next. 3 colorless mana for an uncommon X3, or star 3 rather. It's a construct artifact creature. Its power is equal to the number of artifacts or enchantments you control. In a deck that has a bunch of food, or a deck that's really all in on artifacts and enchantments, this can be a really big beater for 3 mana, but usually not on turn 3, right? Let's say Dream Situation, you go 1 drop, 2 drop, 3 drop artifacts. This is going to be a 3 mana 3/3, and then let's say even on turn 4 you play another artifact or enchantment and it's attacking as a 4/3. Well, that's with the Dream Curve. You got a slightly above average creature that has no evasion, has no trample, has no way to just get through a board stall or anything like that. It's just sheer stats in a archetype that probably doesn't care about just having a big beefy creature on board. It does add to the artifact count, so on its own it's going to be a 1/3, but it needs to be at least a 3/3 before it's better than some of the other artifacts, or rather just vanilla creatures we've already seen in this set. The problem and the reason that I don't put it much higher than this, even though it has the potential to deal a lot of damage, is because the toughness never changes, right? Your opponent can just trade off the same creature regardless of how big the power on this guy is, and that is kind of a hit against it, right? Has the potential to be really strong, but I don't think it's going to get through that much damage when you do have it set up to deal that much, right? Your opponent's just going to block it regardless of how big it is, and it's never really going to deal that much damage to your opponent. Inquisitive Puppet, Mr. Pinocchio, is 1 colorless mana for a 0/2 uncommon artifact creature. It's a construct. When it enters the battlefield, scry 1, and you may exile it with no mana cost, no cost attached to it other than just exiling the puppet. Create a 1/1 white human creature token. So overall, this is kind of a roadblock card. It's pretty annoying, and the fact that it exiles itself instead of sacrificing itself is actually a downside for anything that might care about artifacts in your graveyard. Not sure if those exist or not, but exiling it means that it's just gone forever, right? I don't think this card is very good. I'm actually kind of curious why it's an uncommon. Maybe I'm missing something here as to why this card is an uncommon. Because a 1-mana 0/2 that scries when it enters the battlefield is just not that good of a card. And then being able to block and turn it into a 1/1 and then being able to block again just isn't that good. You're not getting multiple bodies off of this. You're just replacing one with another. And neither of the bodies are good. A 0/2 and a 1/1 just aren't really that impressive, right? If you just sack this right away and you don't get a block out of it, it's like you paid 1 mana for a 1/1 that scries 1, and that's also just not really worth a card here. So I might be missing something here, maybe because it's an artifact and there are some decks that care about artifacts, that this is uncommon, but overall I'm not seeing the power of this card, and you really can only justify it in a deck that cares about having artifacts. Castle Garenbrig is our first land that we'll talk about, and this is a little bit sketchy as far as me putting it this low in the category. I do think as far as like commander and stuff like that goes, this is the strongest castle, but I do think when limited comes around, this is going to be a little bit overrated and not that impressive of a card. So all of the castles share the line of text that they enter the battlefield tapped unless you control a basic of the same color, right? So in this case, Castle Garenbrig will enter tapped unless you control a forest. If you control a forest, it just comes in untapped. And that's the only downside to it, right? It taps to add green, they all tap to add their own color, and then they all have an activated ability for a certain amount of mana. In this case, Castle Garenbrig is 2 green tap, add 6 green mana, but spend that mana only to cast creatures or activate abilities of creatures. So this ramps you, right? This is a land that gets you ahead on 1 mana. You have to tap this and 5 other mana sources, or rather 4 other mana sources, so that's 5 lands to produce 6 mana. It only ramps you ahead by 1, not 2. The problem is that if you're already at 6 mana, if you don't have anything that you're really using that mana on, this is just a glorified forest, right? There are times where you get to curve out and then Castle Garenbrig will get you to your 6-drop 1 turn earlier. But if you're not doing that, this card doesn't really do anything, right? If you're not using the extra mana from the activated ability, this is just a forest that sometimes comes in tapped. And that's really not that impressive. So I do think people are going to have like best case mentality thinking when it comes to Castle Garenbrig, that it's always going to produce some extra amount of mana and they're just going to get to go off a turn earlier. And I don't think they're going to understand that a lot of times this will just tap for green mana and you won't even use the activated ability. So I don't think if I were in a tournament setting where I'm trying to win and I'm super excited about trying to get the best deck possible, that I'm first picking Castle Garenbrig, but if I end up with it in my deck, I'm still going to play it, right? It's still justifiable as a card to put in your deck, and sometimes it'll be quite good. It's just not something that's worth your first pick. Moving right along into our solid playable category, these are the cards that are actually pretty excited about putting in our deck. We want as many of these as we can get. We would rather have some of the stronger cards, but if our deck is made up of mostly solid playables, we're probably just fine and we have a good chance at beating our opponent. First one is Signpost Scarecrow, another Scarecrow. It's 4 colorless mana for a common 2/4 artifact creature. It's a Scarecrow. It has vigilance, and for 2 mana you can add 1 mana of any color. So it has the Prismite ability attached to a 2/4. This card is fine, right? There's nothing exceptional about it. There's really no point in the draft where you're thinking, wow, I really need a Signpost Scarecrow to make my deck tick. But a 2/4 does have a meaningful presence on the board. The activated ability might not even matter for your deck, but in a 3-color deck, this is still mana fixing, even if it's kind of the worst mana fixing you can get. and it has vigilance, so it can do some offense as well. Nothing exceptional about this card, but also just not the worst thing in the world. 4 mana 2/4 is a vanilla creature that you would play some amount of the time in your defensive decks. Giving it some extra tacked on abilities makes it slightly better. And it's worth noting that that activated ability can help you with Adamant, right? If you're trying to cast an Adamant card for green, 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 but you happen to have green, green, black, black on the battlefield, you can use those 2 black mana to produce your 3rd green, and then suddenly you have green, green, green for your Adamant card, right? Won't come up too often, but I imagine that's what this card was designed for, while also doing a decent job at blocking. So nothing super exciting about Signpost Scarecrow. Not a card you really want in your deck, but something that'll make the cut a decent amount of the time. Scalding Cauldron is a single colorless mana for a common artifact. You can pay 3 and tap it, sacrifice it, and deal 3 damage to target creature. This is actually decent as far as artifact-based removal goes. A lot of times this usually costs a little bit extra mana to get on top or on board, or a little bit extra mana to sacrifice it. In this case, I think the numbers are just right for this to be a justifiable removal spell. You can stick this out early enough that it matters for your Artifact Matters card, and then it can take out a small to medium-sized creature. If there are any cards that let you recycle artifacts or get extra artifacts back from your graveyard to the battlefield or to your hand, then Scalding Cauldron can work double time. So I think this is fine. It's not premium removal, but it is do a pretty good job of just destroying a creature. You also have the kind of hidden sorcery mode of just paying 4 mana at sorcery speed to deal 3 damage to a creature. Your opponent can play around this when they see it on board, but that doesn't make it that bad, right? It deals enough damage that this is fine. Only hits creatures, but that's kind of what you're expecting out of your common removal spell anyway. Prophet of the Peak is kind of a generic, clunky game finisher type artifact creature. We see these a lot. 6 mana for a 5/5. It's a common artifact creature. It's a cat. And when it enters the battlefield, scry 2. So just kind of a tiny little bonus tacked on to a 6 mana 5/5. This is the card that makes your deck if you just really need artifacts, or if you really need something to kind of top your curve and just make sure that you have some sort of beef in there. Not an exciting card. I don't think you're ever clamoring to have a Prophet of the Peak, but 5/5, again, has a meaningful presence on board, even if it's not the most efficient body that you can get. Scry 2, fine little bonus tacked onto that. Heraldic Banner is 3 colorless mana for an uncommon artifact. As it enters the battlefield, choose a color. Creatures you control of the chosen color get +1/+0, and it taps to add 1 mana of the chosen color. So as far as mana fixing goes, this card's a little bit awkward, but I do like it, right? So the reason it's awkward is because if you're using it for mana fixing, let's say you're splashing green in your deck or something like that, or let's use a common scenario that's going to come up. You're playing red, white knights, and you're splashing black for some sort of rare knight, right? Well, when the Heraldic Banner comes in, you're more likely to name black on the banner than anything else, since that's why you're playing the banner, is to make sure you can get your 3rd color. But then that part about your creatures getting +1/+0 of the chosen color isn't going to matter as much, so you kind of lose out on that, right? Now, that being said, Heraldic Banner can just be played in a normal 2-color deck as a pseudo-anthem effect, and also as a mana ramp and mana fixing effect, right? Again, if you're red-white knights, maybe you're not splashing this time, then you can just play the banner, name red or white, and it's going to pump all those creatures while also giving you a little bit of extra mana to work around with. Very nice in the flyer deck, especially the flyer deck that cares about artifacts. If you can name blue or white and get some flyers on board, this actually does quite a bit of damage. So as far as a mana rock goes, this is a little bit better than most of the other mana rocks that we've seen in Limited. You just have to make sure that you're using it in the right kind of deck, where both of the abilities of the card are going to matter, right? That's how you really optimize this card, is making sure that you pick a color that you need access to, while also picking a color where your creatures are going to benefit from the 1 extra power that this gives. Gingerbread Cabin is up next. So this is the start of another cycle of lands, these ones being commons with specific basic land types. So Gingerbread Cabin is in fact a forest, so anything that cares about fetching up non-basic forests or just mentions forests will care about Gingerbread Cabin. All of them tap for their requisite color, so Gingerbread Cabin taps for green, and they all say They enter the battlefield tapped unless you control 3 or more other whatever basic land type it is. So Gingerbread Cabin will enter tapped unless you already control 3 or more other forests. Otherwise, it'll come in untapped. And then they all give you a bonus when they do come in untapped. So if you have 3 or more of others of the basic land type of the land that you're playing, you get a bonus. In this case, you create a food token, right? So all of that tied together, you if you have 3 or more other forests when you play Gingerbread Cabin, it will come in untapped and you'll make a food token. If you do not, it'll just be a tapped forest and that's it. And they all kind of fit the same parameter there, give you a different bonus based on whether it came in tapped or untapped. So these are pretty easy to free roll in your deck, right? I don't think the super aggressive decks will want them, but even the red and white lands have nice little aggressive bonuses tapped onto it. In this case, you really, really want to get this food token, right? Because we said in the green video that food token is very valuable for that deck. And this is a nice little bonus. I don't think you run a bunch of these, right? And again, this is another incentive to try and go monocolor or really skew yourself towards being a specific color. But, you know, a food token is not the be-all, end-all when it comes to your mana base. So don't make your mana base just really, really bad to make sure your Gingerbread Cabin is making food. But if you are leaning towards green, if you have a lot of green adamant cards, maybe you have triple green cards in your deck or something like that, then yeah, you can skew green and be a little bit happier about your Gingerbread Cabin. As far as I'm concerned, if you have these cards in your pool, I would probably run about 1 of each. I wouldn't go super hog wild because they do come in tapped a majority of the time. Having 3 other forests and then playing Gingerbread Cabin is not as trivial as it might sound. A lot of times you'll just have the cabin in your opening hand, or you'll have it be your 3rd or 4th land, and you'll just have no choice other than to play it out tapped. And you should do that, right? Don't miss land drops to try and get a bonus off of this. But as far as this entire cycle goes, play smart. If you can get that bonus, then do so. If you can sequence your lands in such a way that this is going to be the 4th forest that you play, then do so. But don't play in such a way that you are messing up your gameplay or messing up your deck building just to get the minor bonuses that these ones give. The red one in the cycle, Dwarven Mine, same deal, enters tapped unless you control 3 or more mountains. When it enters untapped, you create a 1/1 dwarf creature token. A land that just comes down and makes a 1/1 is a pretty solid deal, right? But that 1/1 won't be coming down until at minimum turn 4, right? If you go mountain, 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 Dwarven Mine, then you get a 1/1. And sure, that's a nice little bonus tacked onto a land, but it's not that impressive on turn 4. It's something, but it's not that great. And that's kind of the theme of this cycle is you get something, but you don't get a lot, right? If you have this in your opening hand, you're playing an aggressive deck, just run out your Dwarven Mine. Like, that 1/1's not going to make that big of a deal. But if you can sequence things in a way where you end up with a dwarf on board, then sure, this is a nice bonus. I'm not really taking this card highly, or for that matter, I'm not really taking any of these lands super highly. But if I end up in the colors and it just comes to me really late and there's nothing else to play, I'll probably play one in my deck. We can kind of run through the rest of them pretty quickly because everything I've said about the first 2, I'm going to say about the rest. Witch's Cottage is the swamp. Enters tapped if you control 3 or less, or rather, it enters tapped unless you control 3 or more other swamps. And when it enters the battlefield untapped, you may put target creature card from your graveyard on top of your library. So if that's good for you, then so be it. If not, then who cares? If this self-mill deck comes together, the blue-black self-mill deck, then Witch's Cottage has a little bit of an extra bonus tacked onto it because you might mill over a creature that you really want access to and you can put it back on top. But that's a very specific deck that wants it. Not a bad effect, not card advantage, but it's something. The blue one, very similar. This is Mystic Sanctuary. In this case, when it enters untapped, you get to put an instant or sorcery from your graveyard on top of your library. I actually like that a little bit more than the black one, although the blue one, if you're just using it in self-contained color in a blue deck, you're probably getting a bounce spell or something like that back, or a counter spell, which isn't as great as getting like a full-on removal spell, but you can see combining it with another color, maybe your blue-red or something like that, and you just put a burn spell back on top of your deck. That's not bad. Similar to the cottage. It's not card advantage, but it sets up your next draw, and it's not really worth pushing your mana base to make it work, right? Unless you're a very specific deck that needs certain instants and sorceries to win. But if they're in your graveyard, you probably already got to cast them, and that's usually good enough. And finally, the white one, Idyllic Grange. This one puts a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control when it enters untapped. Similar to the red one, the white decks and the red decks are just going to want to be super aggressive in this format, and trying to get a +1/+1 counter early in the game just isn't feasible. You can't get this on turn 1, 2, or 3, so the earliest you're going to get that +1 counter is on turn 4 or 5, and that's fine, right? It might actually give you a better attack than you had before, so maybe this is the best one in the cycle, this or the green one. Really depends on the way that your deck comes together and how much the bonus actually matters for your deck, but similar to all the other ones, play one. Don't play too many of these unless you're monocolor somehow, in which case, sure, you can get away with playing a couple more of them, but they're not huge payoffs. They're just extra little cards that might make your mana base give you a little bit extra value than it otherwise would. All right, enough about the lands. We're going to get into the high power category. So we're going to see the rest of the castle cycle here and a couple of the other better artifacts, and then we'll talk about the bombs, and by that I mean the single bomb that I have in this category. But for now, the high power cards, ones that we're excited to pick up early, and out of a weaker pack, we can first pick these cards. First one is Golden Egg. Hear me out here, okay? Golden Egg doesn't seem like a high power card, but I assure you it's going to be drafted very highly whether people think it's great or not. So Golden Egg is 2 colorless mana for a for a common artifact. It is a food, so it counts for all of your food benefits. When it enters the battlefield, draw a card. You can pay 1 mana and tap it to sack it and add 1 mana of any color. So you can basically filter mana by sacrificing the Golden Egg, or you can pay 2 mana and sacrifice it to gain 3 life. So it's got the food ability tacked onto it. Very befitting, given that it's a food. Yeah, these sorts of cards, these like early cantrip and artifacts that replace themselves and then also help your mana fixing situation, they just always go early in packs. Think Traveler's Amulet, think Renegade Map, think Terrarion, think Prismatic Lens. All of these cards cantrip and they make your mana smoother, and they don't really cost that much, right? At the expense of using your second turn, if you weren't going to play a creature, then you just play out the Golden Egg. You're not down a card. Your mana fixing is better, and the Golden Egg has a little bit of extra utility. It can gain some life later in the game, and on top of that, it's a food, so it matters for some of your other cards that care about food. I don't think you should expect to see this card after like the 4th or 5th pick. People love these cards, including myself, and they let you get away with splashing a little bit more. They let you get away with just being a little bit greedier. Golden Egg has multiple extra bonuses in this set than these cards typically do. You know, it's an artifact for your Artifact Matters deck. It can filter mana for your Adamant cards and make that a little bit easier. It's a food for your food deck. It can gain life against aggressive deck. Just very versatile card. I don't think you want to run like 5 or 6 of these in your deck, but if you end up with 2 or 3, you're probably playing all of them, and they're going to be decent, right? They can trip at the very minimum, so it doesn't cost a lot to put this in your deck. So if you want this card in your deck, you're going to have to take it highly. I guarantee Golden Egg will never wheel in a draft. Enchanted Carriage is up next. 5 mana for a 4/4 uncommon artifact vehicle. So if you haven't played with a vehicle before, you have to use the crew first in order for it to become a creature for the turn. And in this case, the crew is crew 2. So you have to tap any number of creatures with total power 2 or more, and then that will turn the Enchanted Carriage into a creature just for the turn. You get an extra little bonus when Enchanted Carriage enters the battlefield. Create 2 1/1 white mouse creature tokens. Thank you, Disney. Enchanted Carriage seems pretty good to me. It's a colorless, so it's a safe early pick. It gives you a decent number of bodies, right? Essentially, it's giving you 1/1s, and if those 1/1s die and you don't have many other creatures on board, then the carriage kind of drops off if you can't crew it, but at least it gives you the total power and toughness to crew it right away, and then your other creatures can start crewing it if the mice die by any reason. So I think this card's fine. It gives you some chump blockers or gives you a decent attacker. It's just versatile enough, and it's a colorless card that you can fit it in any deck, and it'll be fine as an early pick, right? If you pick this up, it's not like it's the most exciting card. You're not like, yes, I got an Enchanted Carriage for my deck or anything like that. But since it is colorless and it's just a fine colorless card, you're probably going to play it no matter what deck you end up in, and I think that makes for a safe early pick. Clockwork Servant is 3 colorless mana for a 2/3. It's an uncommon artifact creature. It's a gnome, and it has Adamant. When Clockwork Servant enters the battlefield, if at least 3 mana of the same color was spent to cast it, draw a card. So we talked about Hengewalker, the 2/2 that becomes a 3/3 with Adamant. That card, not that good. Clockwork Servant, very good, although it is a little bit deceptive, right? It's 3 colorless mana, but it's actually a triple color card because you do not play this card unless you're getting the Adamant bonus or unless you absolutely need a 2/3 on board, right? If you miss out on the Adamant bonus, okay, well that kind of sucks, right? You're missing a lot of value, but a 3 mana 2/3 is still something. If you get the Adamant bonus, wow, this card is actually very good, right? 3 mana 2/3 is already an acceptable card, but when it replaces itself, that's pretty good. You do need to do a little bit of work here, though. If you want to curve out into this on turn 3, you need your mana to work in such a way that you're going to have triple color on turn 3, which just isn't going to happen as often as you want it to. But thankfully, Clockwork Servant seems like a decent play even later in the game. So if you play this on turn 4 or 5 or 6, it's still going to cantrip and give you another card. And I would actually hold on to this one, except under dire circumstances. If I'm getting beat down and this is the only thing I can play from my hand to stop that from happening, then yeah, I'm going to go ahead and run out my 3 mana 2/3 vanilla creature. But if I can hold on to this, I'm going to wait until I have triple color to cast this card and make sure I get the benefit off of it. Very sweet card. Again, you don't have to push towards a monocolored deck or anything like that for Clockwork Servant to be good because it's deceptive as a 3-drop. Think of this as like one of those 3-drops that you cast on turn 5 or 6, and then it becomes pretty decent. Fabled Passage, pretty simple rare. This is a land that you can tap and sacrifice to search your library for a basic land card, put it on the battlefield, tap. If you have 4 or more lands, once that land enters the battlefield, you get to untap it, so you get to use it right away. This is an Evolving Wilds, a terramorphic expanse, if you will, that has a tiny little benefit of the land sometimes coming in untapped. Honestly, that doesn't matter that much since it's not too often that you have a bunch of tapped lands and then you play a Fabled Passage and you get to kind of use that mana. In the early game, Fabled Passage is just Evolving Wilds, but in the late game, maybe this is your 5th land, you get to sacrifice it, and you get to use your 5th land right away off the Fabled Passage, which is actually a nice bonus. Not a super powerful card, right? It enables some mana fixing. It doesn't enable ramp in any way, shape, or form, but it's fine, right? If you end up with a Fabled Passage in your sealed pool or in your draft, you should 100% play it, but it's not necessary to take early on in a draft if you're in a tournament setting, right? It's worth a little bit of money, so take it at your F&M, but it's not like your deck becomes super powerful by having a Fabled Passage. It's just a fine card that makes your mana base a little bit more tolerable. Castle Abreth is our red castle. So we already talked about the green castle. We're going to talk about the other 4 now. And I think the benefits from these 4 are all slightly better than the benefit from the green one when it comes to limited. Castle Abreth, again, just to kind of go over the overarching theme, they all enter tapped unless you control a basic land of the same type. This is not a mountain, but if you control a mountain, this will come in untapped. So pretty low cost there, right? It taps to add red mana, as they all do, and for 1 red, you can tap it, and creatures you control get +1/+0 until end of turn. Nice little bonus on a land, right? The fact that these are tacked to lands that don't have that much setup cost, they might come in tapped, which could hurt some amount of the time, but a lot of times they're just going to come in untapped, and then they're going to be a free roll in your deck. You should play them if you have them. Being able to pump all your creatures is a nice ability to tack onto a land, which doesn't cost you a slot in your deck, doesn't cost you a card from your hand, right? You get to just use this land, which you are going to use anyway, and have an extra bonus tacked onto it. Even if you never use that ability on offense or defense, it's nice to have it there as an extra little bonus to what you would otherwise be running as just a basic mountain in your deck, right? So if you can pick up these castles and you are on color, you should play them, but you don't need to necessarily force a color, right? If I start off with a Castle Abreth, then, I don't need to force myself into red. It's not that huge of a payoff, but it is a nice little bonus tacked onto a land. Same thing for the rest of these. Castle Lochthwain is the black one, comes in tapped unless you control a swamp, taps to add black, and the activated ability here is 1 black, tap it, draw a card, then lose life equal to the number of cards in your hand. That is actually very sweet ability. it could be dangerous to use, right? There are times where you are holding 3 or 4 cards in your hand, and drawing a card and losing 4 or 5 life is just not what you can do against an aggro deck or something like that. But if you're holding a bunch of cards in your hand, you don't really need to use your mana to activate this, because you don't really need to draw extra cards. So I kind of like that, right? You can use this to draw cards when you start losing card advantage, right? When you are down on cards, maybe you have 1 or 2 left, then sure, you take a couple points of damage to draw an extra card. Maybe you're empty-handed, and this is just, 3 mana tap, lose a life, draw a card, which is very, very good to have attached to a land. And you get to kind of pick and choose when this is relevant and when you need to use this. This is probably one of the best ones in the cycle. It's just pure card advantage. It does have a pretty hefty cost attached to it, but I think that cost is worth it, especially if you end up with some sort of food deck that can recuperate the loss of life by gaining life and sacrificing the food. So Castle Locthwain, to me, I think is probably the best in the cycle, but they're all pretty close in power level, minus the green one. Castle Ventress is the blue one. Enters tapped unless you control an island. Taps to add blue. For 2 blue, you can tap and scry 2. Again, a nice bonus that's attached to a land. If this was just a basic island, then this is a huge upgrade to that basic island, right? You don't need to first pick this card and force yourself into blue, but if you're in blue and you see this card, maybe second, third pick, I would highly consider taking it. Just add in power to your lands when you otherwise would just be running basics. Gives you a pretty big edge when it comes to limited. Just having your lands do something means that you have more options, more effects than your opponent. And scrying 2 is not terrible. It's expensive, right? You're essentially tapping out for a turn to scry 2, but if you're holding counter spells and your opponent doesn't give you an opportunity to use it, maybe they didn't cast a spell, then sure, this gives you something to dump your mana into. And scry 2 is not a bad mana sink, right? This can set up your draws, so on and so forth. Do everything that scry 2 always does, and that's a nice bonus to have on a land. Finally, the white one, Castle Ardenvale, is a rare. Enters the battlefield tapped unless you control planes. Adds colorless, or rather adds white mana. And for 2 white, you can tap it to create a 1/1 human creature token. Again, same thing as the rest of the cycle. Not an extremely powerful ability, but being able to turn, extra mana into creatures is fine, especially when you didn't really have to use a card out of your hand to do that. Normally, this sort of effect would be attached to an enchantment, and you would be down a card to play that enchantment, and then you'd have to dump additional mana into the enchantment just to make 1/1s. In this case, a 1/1 is not the most exciting thing, but it was at the cost of playing a land that may have come in tapped, but probably didn't, right? A lot of times these lands are going to come in untapped, and then they're just upside on top of a basic. So yeah, none of the effects are super, super exciting. Maybe Locthwain is exciting, but they are bonuses on lands, and that means that if you are on color, you're happy to play these castles. Even the green one, you should play if you are a green deck, like I said, but none of them are bombs, right? They have very temperate abilities on purpose, but relevant abilities, and that makes them good cards. And our final card to talk about here, there's only one colorless card that I thought was really worthy of a first pick, and that is Stonecoil Serpent. It is X colorless mana for a 0/0. It's a rare artifact creature. It's a snake, and it enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it. So if it didn't have any other abilities, that would be a fine card. Think like Ugin's Conjurant with no downside or no upside. Just a vanilla creature that always scales into the game. This is a 3 mana 3/3 if you need it to be. It's a 5 mana 5/5 if you need to curve out there. If you top deck it in a late game, it's a 9 mana 9/9, right? This is just the type of creature card and the type of statting that is always going to be something on curve, and it's probably always going to be the biggest creature on board. I think you want to wait until you can get it up to a 4 mana 4/4 or higher, unless you're really in dire straits and need to cast it. I didn't mention the abilities though. It has more. It has reach, it has trample, and it has protection from multicolored. Not 100% sure how much that protection from multicolored matters, but in the previous video, we went over, 30 multicolored cards, some of which are removal spells, some of which are just really good creatures, and Stonecoil Serpent can't be messed with by any of those cards. It can block all of them. It can attack through all of them. It can't be targeted by the removal spells. This thing has reach and trample, so even the flyers don't get through the serpent. If you can stick this thing on board as a 5/5 or bigger, it is going to dominate offense and defense, and it's going to be randomly protected against some number of your opponent's spells. So I think Stonecoil Serpent, being a colorless card, is an easy first pick. Normally cards like this are, and the fact, same thing I said about the carriage, the fact that this is a colorless card means that you can pick it up early, first or second pick if need be, and it's going to make your deck no matter what, right? Whereas some rares, you first pick a bomb and then you end up in different colors, you don't get to play your bomb. Stonecoil Serpent is just always going to make your deck no matter what, and that makes it a very justifiable, strong first pick. Alright, that's everything from Eldraine. We went through every single card. So if you're one of the 10 viewers of these videos, thanks for hanging out. It's always fun to do these, even though they go a little bit longer than I hope sometimes. But I hope you learned something. I hope I didn't botch it up too much. And I would appreciate some feedback if you want to leave anything in the comments below. Any feedback at all, or any kind of tidbits, if I missed something, if you would like to add something that I've said, if you would like to just show appreciation for the videos, then feel free to in the comments below. You can subscribe to the channel down there too. You can find us on Twitter at MTG_ManaRocks. Good luck with everybody's pre-releases. I hope it all goes well. I hope you have fun playing Shrek the Set, and I'm looking forward to sharing some draft videos with you as soon as we can. So thanks for hanging out. My name's Timothy with ManaRocks, and I'll see you all next time.